Hi, I'm Reverend Sarah Harrison McQueen, and it's my great joy to serve as the senior pastor to the people of Central United Methodist Church in the Arlington District in the Virginia Conference of the United Methodist Church.
I'm Allie Rosner Bass. I am the pastor of Arlington Temple United Methodist Church in Roslyn, also on the Arlington District. And those of you near here may know us as the church over the gas station.
Today, Allie and I are going to be sharing a workshop entitled "The Church Has Literally Left the Building: Property Redevelopment to Live into God's Vision." The reason that, of course, we have this opportunity is that Allie and I are both involved in a building project with our respective churches. We both have very different stories that we'll take turns sharing with you today. But overall, we want to emphasize that, of course, the primary asset of every church is the people in the church. And secondly, we have, most of us, property, and we aren't always using it to the full capacity that we could in order to live out the mission and vision that God has for us in the world. So to tell you a little bit about the project here at Central, it actually needs to go back well before the time that I started serving as the pastor. In 2007, the pastor at the time, Reverend Richard Cobb, invited Bishop Peter Story of South Africa to come and to lead a workshop for the people of Central. And part of that workshop involved taking a prayer walk through our neighborhood. We're located in the Ballston neighborhood of Arlington. And as folks walked around the streets surrounding our church, they saw their eyes open to the needs of their neighbors sleeping on the streets outside the building. The initial response was to provide hospitality to unhoused neighbors by opening the fellowship hall every Friday morning. That hospitality started with just coffee and donuts, and then it expanded over time to include a hot breakfast and a lunch to go. This ministry grew through partnerships with local organizations, with the nonprofit known at that time as the Arlington Street People's Assistance Network, now known as Path Forward, and it also partnered with the Arlington Food Assistance Center. We were able to become a connection point for our guests to meet with social services workers or mental health workers on site, a place for folks to find their physical needs met, their mental needs met, and also their spiritual needs met, as some of our Friday guests became members of our congregation. This was a warm and inviting environment that allowed relationships to build. We're very grateful that the seed money of this feeding ministry began with a bequest that had been given to the Arlington district. There was a woman who wasn't even a Methodist, but when she emigrated to the United States following World War II, she received a lot of support from the Methodist Church at that time. And in appreciation for that, she left money in her will for the Arlington district to support mission that would be specifically serving those who were needing help with housing and with food. So this ministry is what grew. It was a ministry of incredible mercy, of feeding those who were unhoused. And it allowed the congregation to develop relationships in a way that made them ask, how can we take the next step? How can we move into a ministry of justice? How can we solve the problem of homelessness by creating more homes? We were able to issue an RFP, a request for proposal, to nonprofit and for-profit developers to see what ideas they had that would support our vision of affordable housing. In 2015, we spent 90 days in prayer to discern the next steps in our process. We went through a very long and expensive process in our county planning so that we were allowed to have a site plan that would result in a new building that will be 8 stories tall. We'll go underground for 1 level of parking. The first 2 stories will be within a concrete podium that will include space for the church for worship and ministry space, and an expanded preschool that will serve more children and also younger children. And then above that, 5 stories of wood construction apartments that will be owned and operated by a nonprofit housing developer in our community. This will create 144 committed affordable units. It will serve a variety of community members, from 1-bedroom apartments to 3-bedroom apartments. and it will serve folks who are earning between 30% of the area median income up to 60% of the area median income. It's been an incredible transition for us, and there have been a lot of challenges on this journey, but we are excited about the way that God is inviting us to continue to worship and serve and embrace all.
Arlington Temple's story is a little bit different in contrast to Central, where they went out to find God's vision for their church and their community. In our case, our vision kind of came to us. And the background here is that Arlington Temple is on the tip of a block on land that was donated by the owners of the rest of the block back in the 1960s. And so we've had this historical relationship with the owners of the rest of our block there in Roslyn. When I came to Arlington Temple as the pastor back in the summer of 2013, Roslyn was already in the middle of a redevelopment and revisioning and rezoning process called Realize Roslyn. And if you've been to Roslyn recently, you know that it's redeveloping by the day and changing in a lot of other ways too. The whole neighborhood has a whole different feel to it than it did even when I got there 8.5 years ago. And this rezoning process meant that suddenly our air rights and our density, your density is basically how much you can build on any given footprint of land, were suddenly worth a whole lot. But the thing is that because of the way we are locked in on the tip of this block, we couldn't really do much with that on our own in the way that Central is doing with their property. We just don't have enough of a footprint on the ground to be able to build above us on our own. We did briefly look into that. If we did nothing, we would end up kind of being left behind by the redevelopment that was going on around us. For example, most of the skywalks in Roslyn are scheduled to go away eventually as it becomes a more pedestrian-friendly community on the ground. Our main entrance to the church is on a skywalk. So it just kind of wouldn't make sense with the community around us anymore if we didn't do something to redevelop along with the community. At the same time, there were things that we wanted to change about our own building. For example, it was built in 1971. It is still very 70s looking. The main entrance on that skywalk can be kind of hard to find for newcomers. There are at this point lots of repairs that are needed. Also, our sanctuary is really big for our small congregation in a way that kind of dwarfs us on Sunday mornings sometimes. So this whole redevelopment and rezoning process became an opportunity for us to redevelop our building to fit into and engage with the community that is emerging around us, and not just the community that happened to be there in 1971. So what we did is we entered into a business partnership with our next door neighbors, the company that owns the rest of our block. They bought our density and our air rights, and they are building apartments partially on top of us, on top of the church. And they are also building us a new church building as part of the deal. The gas station below us will stay, but we are also setting some money aside to be able to convert that into some other sort of retail space, potentially once its lease runs out in 2046. This whole process on our end has been led by a lay team. We have an engineer, an architect, a lawyer, in addition to several others who are part of our congregation who are on that team, as well as our hired project manager, who we'll tell you a little bit more about later. We are still in the design phase of this whole project. We are hammering out details now. We expect to be out of our current building sometime in 2022. Hard to nail down too much, but we expect to be out sometime in the next year-ish, and to be out of our building for probably about 3.5 years before we are able to move into the new one that will be built on the same site. And we're still figuring out what happens in the meantime in that interim period.
When I first moved to serve at Central in 2014, we thought that within the next year or two, we would be ready to leave that building. And so when I unpacked my books in that office, I didn't expect to get too comfortable. Well, it was 7 years later that I was moving those books home to the parsonage to set up my office now. So in that process, we had a lot of challenges that were specific to our site. We are located directly across from the Ballston Metro Station, which means that we had to work with the local authority, WMATA, to make sure that there weren't going to be any challenges with the Metro tunnel that is underground there. We also needed to work with the local historic preservation group because the folks for whom Ballston is named, the Ball family, donated our land, and previous generations had been buried on that property. The other challenge that came is one that is shared by pretty much every affordable housing project, and that is related to financing. The current way that financing works for this is you can apply for a competitive 9% low-income housing tax credit or a non-competitive 4% low-income housing tax credit. The 9% are the most valuable, and that's why it's important to win that competition if that's the route you're going to go. We attempted to win that competition 2 years in a row, and unfortunately, our project was so expensive that we just couldn't score high enough to finance our project with that route. So instead, we had to rethink some of the details, and we actually changed developers. And so we now are working with a developer who was able to find the right financing for this deal, and we are using the 4% low-income housing tax credits. They were also able to pair that with some other special funds that came into the county because of the redevelopment happening with the Amazon organization. And so those were new funds available that weren't in play at the beginning of our process. There were some other challenges just getting to vacate the site. Of course, when COVID happened, that caused a lot of challenges for all of us to rethink things. But we found through the public challenge of going before the historic board that even though it was adding expense and delays, there was also one unexpected benefit. It caused our congregation to have to go before the public boards on multiple occasions to speak to why we were doing this. And it was clear for us that this was not about money, this was about mission. But what that meant was on a Tuesday night, I had 30 members of my church show up to speak at a public board, and they each had their 2 minutes to speak passionately about how the mission and ministry that God had called us to was so important. And I believe that it was that outside challenge that really helped all of the members of my congregation experience the vision for themselves, because as they had to proclaim to the county why we were doing this, they really saw that God had invited us to transform this property, not to benefit ourselves.
The biggest challenge that I faced in all of this from the beginning was simply the fact that I was clueless. I always tell people that not only did I not learn any of this in seminary, but if they had offered a class in it, I would not have signed up for that. I had no interest in any sort of redevelopment stuff. It was not something that I felt called to. But here we were in this situation at Arlington Temple where we could either say, yes, we will go along with the way our community is developing and changing, or no, we're not going to do that. And I began to realize that sometimes that's actually what call looks like. It's, here I am. So, all right, God, how do I do this? I began by trying to educate myself. I went to some community-based trainings that Sarah recommended to me, but I quickly realized that I was way over my head in all of this. We ended up hiring a project manager, someone who professionally oversees these kinds of projects. This was someone, Bill Krakowski, who was also recommended to me by Sarah. Because he had been overseeing Central's project for a while already. So he not only had experience working with churches through this kind of thing, but also experience with the United Methodist World and United Methodist polity. And Bill has been a godsend for us. He has led us through all of the steps that we need to go through as we kind of feel our way through all of this, through this project. The other thing that has been challenging for us from time to time has been the constant negotiation of our relationship with our next door neighbors and business partners. Bill, our project manager, has guided us through much of that process. Um, and the timeline, as I mentioned before, which can't be nailed down too closely, keeps getting adjusted. We thought that we were signing a contract something like 4 years ago at this point. We just ended up finally signing that this past fall. And there are still legal documents that are ahead of us to sign. And there are terms that keep being renegotiated as we get to different points in the process. So learning to roll with all of that has been big. Learning to make sure in my communication to my congregation that I am preparing them sufficiently for what lies ahead, but also not promising things that are going to change between now and when they actually happen.
So at Central, we have talked a lot about dreams becoming reality. In fact, that was the name of the capital campaign that we had a few years ago that allowed us to really share the vision with the congregation. But like Ali said, we can't promise that everything will be perfect and exactly what we want in the new building. The professionals we work with have said multiple times that we are trying to put a lot of program into a small envelope. We have a small space on a corner of Arlington that will be used for a church to worship, for multiple organizations to use our space for community functions, and of course, our expanded preschool. And then we have 144 units of affordable housing and all of the programming that comes with that. We are thankful we were able to sign our closing documents, and we expect that by the end of 2021, the fencing will be up and the demolition of our building will have begun. Currently, we're scheduled to be able to move back into the building in spring of 2024. With every construction project, I know that things always end up costing a little more and taking a little longer than you expect. One of the advantages of the delays in our process is that it allowed us to make a change in our programming. Initially, I had asked the architects to design a space that would function for live streaming in a few years, because that wasn't something that our congregation was doing currently. With the introduction of the COVID pandemic, every church needed to be live streaming immediately. And so I was able to say to our designers that when we are in our new building in 2024, we have to be able to live stream from day one. And that allowed us to make some changes to the designs, to move some mechanical parts of our HVAC system to make the sanctuary space quieter for recording purposes. And then there were some other things that we could do to help us create a space that will be flexible enough to serve future generations. 50 years ago, we couldn't have envisioned videos and PowerPoint as part of worship, and yet many churches include that on a regular basis. So 50 years from now, I don't know what God's people will need as they worship in that space. And so my hope has been that we would create a flexible space that would allow the congregation to grow, and that would allow the congregation to grow into God, who God is calling them to be, to serve the people of Ballston in that era. Our space will support who we are today. It will honor and recognize who we have been. And my prayer is that it will help sustain ministry for the next 100 years.
Again, we are still looking ahead to what a lot of this means for us in the next few years. We have already learned a lot during COVID about how to be a church without a building. But in some ways, I think we've also learned how important having a building can be. For example, a big part of our ministry at Arlington Temple pre-COVID was the fact that our doors to the church were open during the day, and our unhoused neighbors could come in and find a place to just sit down and rest for a while, to get something to eat out of the food basket in our fellowship hall, heat up some SpaghettiOs in the microwave, stuff like that. And while we have continued to feed our neighbors throughout COVID, now that our physical doors are closed during the week, we haven't been able to welcome them in the same way. Having a building has been important to us for doing ministry like that. So there are questions that lie ahead for us. How do we function as a church without our own building in that interim period when we don't have one. It's unclear what kind of space we're going to end up having, whether we have a home base that is ours throughout the week all the time, or whether we end up renting office space somewhere and then a separate worship space for Sundays. We simply don't have all of the information that we need to be able to plan that out yet. My hope and prayer, though, is that this time, this interim period out of our own building is something that is going to force us to be out in the community more, that we will be able to develop relationships with people in the places that we are renting, that we'll be able to have meetings in community spaces, that we will find ways to serve and do outreach that don't just depend on us having a fellowship hall that we can open, that we will be able to figure out what it means for us to really go out into our community instead of just expecting the community to come to us. And then in 4.5 years or so, when we do move back into our newly developed building, that we will be able to take some of those lessons with us as well.
So you've heard the story that Allie and I shared about our journey into this redevelopment process that we're each embarking on. And you may be thinking that this is something that you are interested in. If you have any interest in embarking on a redevelopment project, reach out to Enterprise Community Partners and their faith-based initiative. The Reverend David Bowers has launched their faith-based development initiative that supports churches to grow capacity to do these types of projects. They do this through different training. They currently have webinars that are being offered. They also do this through grant making. We were able to receive a grant from them early on to do some of our early due diligence, including environmental studies and geotech studies on site. I also found some connection from local colleagues who were undergoing certain projects similar to ours and was able to learn more about the local Arlington process to go through this approval process at the county level. I also always recommend that you pray a lot, and then pray some more. The motivation for this must be missional and cannot be about money. And so if you are at all interested in this type of an endeavor, I encourage you to invite as many folks into this prayer process with you. Our 90-day of prayer journey in 2015 was a vital part of our project. Our 2017 capital campaign was also bathed in prayer. And so I think that there is nothing more that you can do to begin a project like this than to invite the right people to be praying about it with you and for you.
In the past couple of years, I think that Sarah and I have both fielded questions from a number of people whose churches are discerning whether to embark on this kind of project. We have become something of the resident experts, which I think is a little bit funny to both of us, but again, here we are. And what I always tell people when they ask me what they should do or where they should start is to call Bill Krakowski, the guy who has served as the project manager for both of our projects. And he's really the one who helped us know what steps needed to come in what order, what we needed to do, and who has really advocated for us throughout the process. And so Sarah and I wanted to give you just a few minutes to be able to hear from Bill Krakowski yourselves.
Hi, I'm Bill Krakowski with Requity Real Estate Group, a boutique real estate advisory firm in the Washington, D.C. area, and I've worked with property owners, churches, developers, institutions, etc. across the country. I'm currently working with 5 churches here in the D.C. area with regard to their potential development or redevelopment of their various sites. What I'd really like to share with you today, though, is the framework for success that I've witnessed my church clients accomplish over the last several years. Step 1 is determining what you want and what you have. So there are 3 parts to that. First part is, what are your church's needs and goals with respect to facilities and real estate requirements to carry on the evangelical calling of the church? Step 2 is, what are the church's mission and the requirements for the future for that mission, for carrying out that mission as it relates to facilities? The third step is figuring out what you have. You will need to evaluate your real estate and facilities to see if they can accommodate your needs and goals, whether or not that allows you to have excess real estate that you can monetize. And that's an important part. The first 2 points above require discernment on the part of the church, probably the leadership and the congregation, to determine the church needs and the mission needs. Mission needs could be affordable housing, preschool, schools, feeding the homeless, music and arts, etc. The third step, assessing what you have, is where you may desire to get some help from a real estate professional. This person can help you assess your real estate requirements for your intended uses, determine what the zoning allows, what uses are allowed on the site, what density can be achieved, how much can be built on the site, is there excess density available that you can actually sell or monetize, and determine the feasibility of putting all that together. And then determine what next steps are necessary to accomplish those goals if that's what you desire. The third step is critical in determining your potential options for the future. Step 2, setting up for success. Putting together a legal structure that works for the church is fairly simple. We just need to figure it out. Are you selling land, selling buildings, renting land, or ground leasing, or renting buildings? Properly preparing legal documents, protecting the church, maximizing flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. The most important thing for success in my mind from the church's perspective is the church needs to organize internally to prepare for this process. Putting together a leadership team or a building committee that can oversee the project and the consultants, any other committees you may need, finance, legal, mission, etc., ensuring a streamlined decision-making process. That's critical to make this successful. The church needs to participate in this project every step of the way, even after the project is complete, to ensure success and consistency of the church's message and mission. One person can't do this alone. Step 3, executing the plan. I won't go into the details, but it's hiring the consultants, the real estate consultants, architects, zoning attorneys, et cetera, et cetera. Do you meet with county or city officials? Do you prepare an RFP for developers to compete? You need to figure that out in the process. I want to throw out a few examples so you can get a sense of the variation and options that are available to you. 2 of them you know well: CUMC, Central United Methodist Church. Next one, Arlington Temple. Third project, National Presbyterian Church, I'm doing in Washington, D.C. It was a master plan completion. The church desired to do monetization, but needed to update their facilities. So we really focused on wayfinding and ADA and front door issues and renovating the church and providing more meeting space, etc. They hadn't renovated in 50 years, and performed deferred maintenance, which is a big issue as well. We focused on the master plan. The renovation is now complete. It was a success. They did a $14 million capital campaign, which also was successful, and they're going to focus on monetization next. First Christian Church of Falls Church desired to monetize their land for cash needs for facilities and mission. Through an RFP process, we selected Wesley Housing as a developer partner. We're going to sell land so they can develop affordable senior housing, and the project is going through the county process now. I'm going to stop there as the last example. Hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your projects.
Well, I hope this workshop has been a helpful outline for you. God may be inviting your congregation to rethink how to utilize your property or not. There are lots of ways to engage with the creativity of God's Spirit in your midst. I trust that you will listen closely to the invitation God is extending to you and to your community about how you are being called to embody the good news today in your context.
I want to close here with a quote from Jesus from the Gospel of Luke. He says, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.'" I encourage you that if you are thinking of embarking on this kind of redevelopment project with your church, to really sit down and count the cost, to know that this will be a major focus of your ministry and your time and effort for years to come. Literally, it's been 8.5 years and still going for us. However, we do hope that if God is leading your church in this direction, to be able to further your mission in your community through what your building can do, then we hope that you will be helped by our stories.